Good evening, Genesis friends and family. Pastor Joe here, and welcome to Wednesday's edition of Victory Week as we're making our way through the Gospel of Matthew, looking at the final week of Jesus' life. And the question that we're going to examine in our brief time together this evening is this question: are you plotting or are you perfuming? Are you plotting or are you perfuming? So turn with me in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 26, and we're going to look at the first 16 verses. So follow along with me starting in verse 1. It says this: When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Let's not do this during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw this, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble this woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. You know, what's interesting is we look at this passage just a few days before Jesus is going to be tried and eventually crucified. We see all sorts of plotting in this passage. That's plotting with 2 T's, plotting, not plodding along, but plotting, trying to take matters into our own hands. And what's amazing is the way that this chapter opens up. In light of all this plotting that's happening in this passage, it opens up in verses 1 and 2, where Jesus proclaims God's providential plan. And this is the 4th time now in Matthew's gospel where Jesus is reminding his disciples, reminding his followers that he is going to go to the cross to die. And they still don't get it. But it's not just the disciples who don't get it. It's the religious leaders in Israel who don't get it. It's the world leaders, the Roman Empire, who don't get it. No one gets it except one person in this passage. But hang on to that thought. What we then see as we shift to verses 3 through 5 is the first plot, and that's this: a plot to protect professional power. Where do we see that? Well, what we see in verses 3 through 5 are the religious leaders in Israel who are supposed to be representing God himself. They're gathering together, and out of jealousy of Jesus, because it's recorded in the Gospels in several places that the religious leaders were envious of Jesus. They were jealous at how he was drawing the common people to himself. This is why they say in verse 5, we got to be careful with our plot here. We got to be careful with the timing because we don't want to cause a riot among our own people. We need to be careful. We need to do this quietly, subversively, to take him down, secretly. And what's their motive? Well, their motive is to protect their professional power. It's to protect their position. You see, they were in a really interesting spot as leaders in Israel because Rome, the world empire of that day, was occupying Israel. So rather than leaning into Jesus, who was the Messiah, the anointed one, who the Old Testament had prophesied would arrive and would set the people free, the religious leaders looked at him as nothing but a threat to their position and their power. And so they developed a plot. But that's not the only plot that we see in this passage. Jump with me to the end, verses 14, 15, and 16. It says this: One of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver Jesus to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. From that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. Here's the second plot, okay? It's Judas's plot. And the plot is this. It's a plot to promote political power. You say, Pastor Joe, where do you get that from? These verses are clear that he's greedy. Well, he is greedy. In fact, Judas was so greedy that in John chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, it tells us that in a similar occasion, when another woman had anointed Jesus, that Judas, he said, you know what? Unbelievable. What a waste. All that money could have been given to the poor. And the Apostle John reminds us, Judas didn't care about the poor. He said this because he was the keeper of the money for the disciples, and he would often go into it, and he was a thief. He would pull money out and use it for his own advances. So he was looking and chastising this woman because he was saying, oh my gosh, there's more money that I could have had. So yes, he's greedy, but there's a whole lot more here. Here's why. If we look at the name Iscariot, he's known as Judas Iscariot. Iscariot means a couple of things if we look at a word study on that. Number one, it could mean man of Kirioth. Kirioth was simply just a town in ancient Israel, so hey, he's a man from Kirioth, Iscariot. But interestingly enough, it also could mean this. He is a man of the city. Now that's interesting because when we trace cities all throughout the Bible, it's not that cities in and of themselves are evil or culture in and of itself is evil. What we see in the Bible is a paradigm where the city represents the human establishment in opposition to God. Not just on a personal level, but on a collective level. So it's interesting that his name could be translated, he's a man of the city. He's a city slicker is another way this could be translated. There's a lot of meaning behind this name Iscariot. Here's the last way that it could be translated. There's an old Hebrew word pronounced sikrin. This was a word that ancient Jewish commentators would use to refer to robbers or violent people. Interesting, right? What's even more interesting is that this word, when we trace it throughout history, becomes attached. It changes a little bit, and it becomes attached to a violent political group that was a splinter group from the Zealots. The Zealots were a group in Jesus' day that wanted to oppose Rome, overthrow Rome, and establish a king in Israel, an earthly king. But this splinter group that came out of that group was even more violent. They were known as the 𝐃𝐞𝐯𝐢𝐨. And what they would do is they would keep daggers in their cloaks and they would stab people in mass gatherings to incite riots in the city. So Iscariot can mean a number of different things. This is important because what we can see as we piece together these contextual and historical pieces is that Judas wasn't just greedy for money. He was greedy for political power. Some commentators speculate that when Judas turns Jesus over in the Garden of Gethsemane with that kiss of betrayal, that he is turning Jesus over because he's trying to do Jesus a favor. He is trying to incite a riot and a war so that Jesus would establish himself as the rightful king in Israel. This is purely from a finite human perspective with impure, evil motives. But Judas thinks he's doing Jesus a favor, but it's not just doing Jesus a favor, he's doing himself a favor. Because, follow this logic, if he would incite a war and if Jesus would establish himself as the earthly king, what would that mean for Judas, who could come all the way around and say, Jesus, this was my brilliant idea. You should put me second in command. These are plots. These are deviant, evil plots from a finite human fallen perspective. Here's the third plot that we see in this passage. This one's a little bit more subtle. Back up with me to verse 6. When Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. So the picture is he's eating or talking at the table with his disciples. This woman comes in, and she anoints his head with the oil. Here's the disciples' response, verse 8. When they saw it, they were indignant. They were angry, saying, why this waste? What's going on here? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. You know what? This might not have been a plot that was well thought out. This was more of a response or a reaction from the disciples. But here's the plot. Their plot was to be spiritually superior. See, they saw the actions of this woman. They viewed them as selfish, as unspiritual. They thought she was being foolish and wasteful. What's interesting is there's a parallel passage in Mark chapter 14 that describes this same story only it colors in a little different details. And if you look at verse 5, it tells us the sum or the amount of money that this oil, that this perfume was actually worth. It says it was worth 300 denarii. Now, that's about a year's wage for someone. It's a lot of money. So the disciples, at first glance, they've got pure motives. They want to give to the poor. Jesus, his ministry was not only to the poor, but he had a focus on the poor. Jesus cared about the poor. God, all throughout his word, cares about the poor. So at first glance, the disciples, maybe part of their motive was pure. But yet at the same time, they're scornfully looking down at this woman. They're missing what she's doing. They're missing this act of worship because they, in their pompous nature, in their haughtiness, they're saying, no, this is wrong, this is foolish, this is wasteful. Ugh, if she was only as spiritual as we are, she would have done this. As we continue through this passage, where we've now seen a plot to protect professional power, a plot to advance political position and power, and now a plot to be spiritually superior, Jesus rebukes his disciples in love, and he says, you missed it. You missed the core of what's happening here. And that's where this passage, smack dab in the middle, has this story of what this woman does. Because what we see here is an act of worship. It's a pleasing aroma of perfume that's lifted up to God the Father, and Jesus the Son's response is what the Father's response is: gratitude, love, embrace. Jesus says this to his disciples. In verse 10, why do you trouble this woman? Mark's gospel actually tells us that the disciples heaped insults on the woman. He says, why do you trouble this woman? For she's done a beautiful thing. Notice his word, beautiful. She's done a beautiful thing. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Here's the point. This particular verse here in verse 11 is often misquoted. Jesus is quoting this verse. And when his disciples would have heard it, they would have finished the verse out in their own minds. This is Deuteronomy 15:11. Listen to this. For they will never cease to be poor in the land. That's what Jesus is quoting. Finish the verse. Therefore I command you, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. So Jesus is not saying, hey, make excuses for not having to care for the poor. He's not saying that at all. In fact, he's saying, no, you're right. You are to care for the poor. But you guys, you're missing the bigger picture of this moment. I have said to you now for the fourth time, I am going to die. I am going to be crucified. You're missing it. You're missing the moment. Why? Because just like everyone else in this passage, you are plotting your own story. And you are striving in your own strength, and you are trying to force things and make things happen that are not for you to make happen, or you to force to happen, or for you to be able to make happen. You simply need to trust me. And so it's this beautiful, beautiful story of what this woman is doing. Mark 14:3 reminds us that this was costly. We said in verse 5, it tells us how costly it was, but it says it was costly, and then it says this. It actually gives us the impression that the flask that the perfume was in was itself costly, and Mark tells us in verse 3 that she broke the flask and then pours this perfume out on Jesus' head. Some commentators think, they speculate, that this perfume that she had could have been her whole inheritance. It's worth that much. It's amazing when you think about that. She's breaking it, symbolically representing her brokenness before Jesus. She's pouring out this oil on him. It's interesting when we think about prayer in the Bible, it often talks about how prayer is a pleasing aroma that comes up to God. When we seek him, when we search him, when we humble ourselves before him, and that's what this woman is doing. And absolutely no one in this passage outside of Jesus gets it. And Jesus commends her. He says, guys, look, she gets it. She understands who I am. She understands what I am about to endure. She understands the significance of my life and the sacrifice and how I'm about to lay my life down. Guys, you don't get it. You don't get it. You're missing the moment. She is responding to my love by displaying love. She is responding to my sacrifice by displaying great sacrifice. And you are scorning her. You are insulting her. You are abusing her. I need to rebuke you for this. Friends, think about that. Her act of worship was costly. Her act of worship was a heartfelt level response to the love that she encountered in Jesus. She's the only one in this passage to get it. She's it. And Jesus' response is one of embrace. In fact, his response isn't just of embrace, but he reminds us anytime the story is told, you're going to hear about this woman and her act of worship. And I can't but help wonder, this is only a few days before Jesus is taken, falsely accused, whipped, beaten to the point where his back looks like spaghetti, and then hung on the cross. I can't help but wonder, as he was enduring all of that, could he still smell the perfume on him? Could he still smell this oil, this nard oil on him? Very costly. It was the gold standard of perfume and oil in that day. And as he's being beaten, and as he's being tortured, and as he's being spat upon, and as he's being falsely accused, and as he's having a crown of thorns driven into his head, the whole time, could he smell this and be reminded of the costly act of worship that this woman did for him to help motivate him and encourage him in his journey? Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that somehow caused him to do it. I'm simply asking the question. Did this move him? Because it sure seems like it moves him in this passage in Matthew 26. The very heart of God. Sacrificial worship out of love for him. So friends, tonight, let's consider, where are we in this story? Do we plot? Do we struggle and strive in our own strength to try to pull ourselves up and will ourselves to make something happen? Do we protect our professional status? Do we bully others and abuse them, and maybe it's just behind closed doors, heap insults on them because they're not as spiritual as we are? And are we even at times like Judas, where we might want to co-opt Jesus for our own political agenda? We might want to co-opt Jesus for our own greed, our own advancement, where Jesus just revolves around me and my world, and I do what I want and I ask him to bless it, and I get upset when he doesn't. Because this woman's act of worship shows us that as Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross, what moves him the most is a loving act of costly worship. So friends, where are you in this story? Are you plotting or are you perfuming? Have a wonderful evening.